Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. Today we're out here in the garden. As I'm filming this, it is early October, but I probably won't post this video for a few weeks, so it might be sometime in November when you see this. Today we're doing a recap video. I like to do a variety of recap videos at the end of the season, just kind of going over different parts of the gardening season. Today, for example, we're going to be focusing on pepper varieties. But I find that the end of the gardening season, while everything is still fresh in my mind, is the ideal time to really reflect and to think about changes that I want to make for next season or things that I want to keep the same. So even though I know when you see this, it is going to be either the end of gardening season or gardening season is going to probably be winding down for you, depending on where you are in the world and what your weather is like, it may not necessarily seem like the obvious time to post this kind of video. I know starting in January, pretty much as soon as Christmas is over, is when I start really getting serious about garden planning. But as I mentioned, I find it useful to kind of at least get an idea of what kind of varieties I'm going to grow next year while the current gardening season is still kind of winding down because everything's fresh in my mind. So as I said, at this time it is early October. We have not yet had our first frost, although we don't have anything in the forecast. But here in Connecticut, we usually have our first frost sometime around mid-October as average. The last couple years, it's been a little bit later. It's been more like late October. Sometimes we get lucky and it's into early November. So I'm not sure what it's going to be this year. But at the time I'm filming this, we are still getting lots of peppers. So I've actually been surprisingly really happy with our pepper yield this year. I say surprisingly because we actually had a lot of rain, more than normal and more than peppers usually prefer. So what I'm planning to do in this video is to just talk about the different types of peppers that I grew in the garden this year. This is a recap of my 2024 gardening season, basically how all of the peppers that I grew this year did. So I'm just going to mention how certain varieties did for me. Some of them did really well, some of them not as well. Obviously, you may have completely different results from me, especially if you're growing in an area with very different growing conditions. But I do find that it is really useful to hear how different varieties performed for different people. And it's also a really fun way to maybe find out some new varieties that you want to add to your wish list to try growing next year. So I'm going to start with hot peppers. I'm going to go through a few of those. I only grew a handful of hot pepper varieties this year. Once I finish that, we will jump over to sweet peppers. So let's just get started right away with our hot peppers. So every year in my garden, we grow jalapenos. You know, that is basically the classic, probably the most essential hot pepper that everyone thinks of when you think of hot peppers. It usually has a really, I want to say, an accessible heat level. You know, it's got some spice to it, but it's usually not overwhelming to the point where most people can enjoy food cooked with jalapenos. That being said, even within the jalapeno family, there are multiple varieties and there are different spice levels. So we usually like to grow a few different types of jalapenos. So this year we grew 3 types of jalapenos. All of them did really well for us this year. The first one that I want to mention is one of the classic jalapeno varieties, and that is the early jalapeno. This is an heirloom jalapeno variety. It's open pollinated, which means that as long as you prevent cross-pollination, you can save the seeds from this pepper and know that you're going to get the same plant again next year. I always like to grow at least a few varieties that are open pollinated because that way I know that no matter what happens, if there's some sort of seed shortage or crop failure, I know that I can have access to my own seeds, I can save seeds, and know that I can grow some of my favorite varieties. So the early jalapeno, most years, tends to be a very mild jalapeno in my experience. We also grow a couple other varieties that are a little bit spicier. The early jalapeno is generally the one that I prefer because I'm a little bit of a wimp when it comes to heat. I like a little bit of heat, but I don't like to be overwhelmed with spiciness. So the early jalapeno is usually my favorite jalapeno variety that we grow. This year, I don't know why. I guess I just don't really understand what makes peppers hotter than others, what weather conditions lead to that. So this year, for some reason, all of the hot pepper varieties that we grew were significantly hotter than normal. I didn't try any new hot pepper varieties this year, so they were all ones that I was familiar with and familiar with what the heat level normally was, and they were all hotter this year. I'm not sure what it was. So this year, there weren't really any jalapenos that were at my spice level. I can still use them in cooking and just use a smaller amount of them. But it's just an interesting observation that for some reason this year, the peppers were all hotter than normal. Now the second variety of peppers that we grow that always does really well for us is the jalafuego. As you might guess from the name, jalafuego, ends with fire. That's going to be a pretty spicy variety, and it definitely was. That one normally is a little bit hotter than I personally prefer, and this year, was another level above that. So that one always yields really well. They tend to be, as I said, spicier than the early jalapeno, in our experience at least. They, according to plant descriptions, it's supposed to be more prolific than the early jalapeno, but in our experience, both plants have been really prolific. They've produced quite a few peppers. So I'm not sure if I've really noticed the difference in yield between the two different pepper varieties. One thing to note about the jalafuego pepper is that that is a hybrid, which means that if I decided to save seeds from it, which you can save seeds from hybrids, you're just not really guaranteed. You don't know exactly what you're going to get if you plant those seeds. So if I planted seeds from the jalafuego, they aren't necessarily going to come true to type. They won't be exactly like the parent plant. So that's just something to note, that is a hybrid plant. The third type of jalapeno that we grew this year is the Craig's Grande jalapeno. Now I will say, I think that one, it's supposed to be larger than the other pepper varieties, the other jalapeno varieties that I mentioned. I don't know if it really was larger this year, but I think that I harvested it a little bit on the early side. So it wasn't full grown when I harvested it. I wanted to make a big batch of pickled jalapenos and also a batch of cowboy candy. And I didn't have quite enough jalapenos that were fully ready to make the big batch that I wanted to make. So I grabbed a few that weren't quite ready yet. So the Craig's Grande, at that point that I harvested it, was about the same size as the other jalapeno varieties. I didn't really let it get full size. I think there are still a few on the plant. So if we have enough time before frost for those to really get larger, I'll update you on that and let you know how large they did get. But I have been happy with all three pepper varieties. I like growing multiple varieties of even similar peppers like that because of the difference in heat levels, and just because sometimes if there's some sort of weather condition that adversely affects a certain type of pepper, another pepper, even though it's similar, may perform better. So I don't like to grow just one variety for that reason. As I said, we were happy with all three of those pepper varieties, so I would recommend all of those. So the next hot pepper variety that we grew this year was the cayenne pepper. This is your classic long, skinny red pepper, very spicy, not something that I would enjoy on its own. Mostly, my personal reason for growing the cayenne pepper is mostly to use in herbal medicine. So I like to make fire cider. And rather than using ground cayenne in the fire cider, a lot of times the recipe will call for you to basically ferment a mix of medicinal herbs like garlic and onion, plants like that are really pungent, in apple cider vinegar. And then at the end, when you strain all those out, it calls for you to add ground cayenne powder. Instead of doing that, what I prefer to do is just to add some fresh cayenne peppers right into the mix along with the onion and garlic and everything else right in the beginning. So for that reason, I like to have it. I also find that they dehydrate really easily. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll harvest them, I'll just slice them in half and let them dry out on my counter. And in my experience, they've dehydrated really well on their own. I don't even have to put them in the dehydrator or anything like that. And then I can just either keep them as half peppers, use them whenever I need to season something or spice something up, or I can grind them into powder and use them that way. So mostly I use them, as I said, in herbal medicine and seasoning. This pepper is really beautiful. All the long red peppers, they're really pretty. And I find that it always is really reliable. It's very prolific for us. So we always have more cayennes than I can really use. Another thing that I really like to do with cayenne peppers, my husband is a little more heat tolerant than I am. So I like to make him a big batch of pickled jalapenos at the end of the season. All the jalapenos that we have left, I pickle them and can them. And that way we have fresh jalapenos for tacos and other things like that. He likes to add them to his scrambled eggs and things like that. So sometimes, this year I don't think it's going to be the case since everything was so much hotter than normal. But a lot of times our jalapenos tend to be a little bit milder than he prefers. So when I'm pickling up those jalapenos, I will slice up a couple cayennes and kind of toss them into the mix. And that will really heat up the jalapenos. So that's another way that I really like to use them. The final hot pepper that I want to mention this year is the lemon drop pepper. Now these are cute little yellow peppers. You know, they look a lot more innocent than they really are. They pack a punch. Those have some significant heat to them. I will say the actual flavor behind the heat is really interesting and really unique. It is kind of fruity, kind of citrusy. Even the smell when you're dicing them up or chopping them up, it smells very different from, say, a jalapeno or a cayenne, one of those, you know, kind of classic peppers. These are definitely have a more interesting flavor. They are too hot for me, so I don't really get to enjoy that interesting flavor, but my husband does enjoy them. Mostly what I do is similar to what I mentioned with the cayenne, adding them into pickled peppers. So, you know, I'm calling them pickled jalapenos because it's primarily jalapenos, but what I really make is a pickled hot pepper mix. And I have been adding some of those lemon drop peppers directly into that pickled pepper mix as well, and it just adds a little more heat, it adds a little more complexity, plus it looks really pretty in the jar just having little bits of yellow mixed in. I find that the lemon drop pepper yields really well. This is the second year that I've grown it, and both years it has yielded really abundantly, a great harvest. If I was a little less of a wimp and I liked heat a little more, I think that I would really enjoy doing a lot more with those peppers. Now it does seem like a pepper that would make a really interesting hot sauce because it's not just heat, because it has all that other complexity of flavor too. So if you have made a hot sauce with lemon drop peppers or with another similar type of fruity pepper like that, I would love to hear how that came out from you. I would love to hear how you changed it up to make it a little more interesting or different than a classic hot sauce that's really just about heat. I would just love to hear how you kind of play on that fruity flavor. So just something interesting that I would love to hear from you guys if you have any experience with that. So one other additional hot pepper that I actually almost forgot about is the poblano pepper. I actually really enjoy the poblano pepper because while it is technically a hot pepper, it's mild. You know, it has a little bit of heat to it, but it's less spicy than the cayenne. It's larger. It's probably partly between the size of a large jalapeno and a bell pepper. So I do normally really enjoy those. This year I was planning to grow them, hoping to make a version of cowboy candy that was less spicy. That was my original plan for them. So what I ended up doing, because all of the jalapenos were so much hotter than usual, I ended up mixing some poblanos into the regular cowboy candy mix to try to tone it down a little bit so that we would still have some great flavor without the overwhelming amount of heat. And I will say it was still an overwhelming amount of heat. So still a little bit spicier than I would prefer, probably the perfect spiciness level for my husband. So we still do have some poblanos on the plant. They are on the small side because I used the ones that were ready when I made the cowboy candy. So I'll have to figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of those poblanos. Maybe I'll end up making a second batch of cowboy candy with just poblanos, or I may just freeze them and use them in cooking over the winter. One thing that I have done with poblanos in the past that I find works really well is I will take the peppers, I'll put them under the broiler, I'll blister them, and then you put them in a bowl and cover it with plastic wrap. Basically let them steam. And then the skin will kind of start to peel back. You peel off the skin and you're left with the nice pepper flesh underneath. I chop that up and then I freeze it in a little freezer bag, and it is great to add into different chilies over the winter. So that is probably one of my most common ways to use poblanos. I do really enjoy them that way. If you have other ways that you love using poblanos, I would love to hear that from you too. So that was the end of the hot peppers that we grew this year. Next, I want to talk about sweet peppers. Now, I have been on a quest for the past several years to find some great options to replace bell peppers in my garden. It has been my experience that while bell peppers are delicious, and when you have a nice bell pepper, there really is nothing else like it, I find that bell pepper plants tend to not yield as well for me in the garden. While I usually get a few great peppers from each plant, I don't really get enough that I feel like it's worth allocating the space to those plants. So there are other sweet pepper varieties out there that in many ways, depending on how you're planning to cook with them, in many ways can be interchangeable with bell peppers. So I have been on the quest to find replacements for my bell peppers, and I think I have some great options this year. Last year I tried the red Corno de Toro and the Corno de Toro yellow last year. So I tried both of those for the first time. And that was my strategy. I was basically trying to try both of those out and see how they compared to classic bell peppers. Now these are a longer, skinnier pepper. I think it's considered like a frying pepper. the walls are maybe a little bit thinner than bell peppers, but I find that they do compare pretty well. The shape is different. So if you're looking for stuffed bell peppers, it might not be an exact replacement for you unless you're willing to kind of have an elongated, skinnier pepper. It kind of depends on what you're going for, I guess. But I found that flavor-wise, they compare really well to bell peppers. And size-wise, they might be a little bit smaller, but the plants yield more peppers in my experience. So, as I said, it's only my second year growing those varieties, but I was really happy with them both last year and this year. We've harvested quite a few of those so far this year, and I have a lot more on the plants. I have some that are starting to change color and quite a few that are green. Now, you could harvest those green as well and use them as a replacement for green bell peppers. I personally prefer my bell peppers or my sweet peppers to be fully ripe for the most part. I prefer them to be fully ripe, whether they're red, yellow, orange, whatever color they end up being. I just find that they're a lot sweeter that way. I find that the flavor is more complex and interesting. Of course, the drawback to that is that you have to wait longer for your harvest, and often you get a smaller harvest overall. If you harvest the peppers early while they're green, the plant is going to get a signal that it needs to make more peppers because it hasn't completed its mission of producing viable seeds yet. So it's kind of a trade-off. Because I like my peppers ripe, I don't always get as many, but I enjoy the flavor more. So as I said, the red Corno de Toro and the yellow Corno de Toro, grew both of those this year. They were really delicious. I was happy with both of them. Because I really enjoyed those so much last year, but my favorite bell pepper is actually an orange bell pepper. I was on a mission to find an orange Corno de Toro variety, and I found that it does in fact exist. It is kind of rare and tricky to find, but I was able to find seeds from it from, I want to say the company was called Texas Hot Peppers. It was something similar to that. So it's a seed company, you know, unsurprisingly, that specializes in peppers, and I found that they had a really big selection of peppers, and they had the orange Corno de Toro seeds, so I did end up ordering those and growing those this year. I really enjoyed them. I found that as far as yield, they were really similar to both the red and yellow varieties. They yielded really well. Peppers were similar in size. You know, the flavor's a little bit different because the flavor between each color will have just a slightly different flavor. But that's what I was going for. I really enjoyed the orange this year, and I made a point to save seeds from it because the seeds are a little bit challenging to find, but these are open pollinated varieties. That means I can save my own seeds. So now I have my own supply of orange Corno de Toro peppers. Now, as I said, I went looking for the orange Corno de Toro variety. While I was looking for that, I found they also offered a similar variety called the Corno de Toro chocolate, which is a beautiful chocolate brown. So you know me, I'm unable to resist interesting varieties of vegetables like that. So I ordered both colors. I was really happy with the chocolate variety as well. You know, basically the same story. It worked really well as a bell pepper replacement. Anything that you're planning on using a bell pepper in that requires it to be chopped or cut into strips, anything like that, any of the Corno de Toro varieties work really well as a substitute for that. So I was really happy with the yields, the flavor, everything. So I'll be growing all 4 colors of those again next year. Now, one other sweet pepper variety that I grew this year that I will always grow because it's delicious is the shishito pepper. This is probably the only sweet pepper on my list that I wasn't basically trying to use as a bell pepper replacement. This one, you know, it's its own thing. These are usually harvested green. This is one of the few exceptions to my liking to eat it when it's ripe rule. So they're pale green, so they're a fairly small pepper. I harvest them when they're green, and what I like to do, my favorite way to cook them, and this is a very common way to cook them, I think this is a lot of people's favorite way, is to poke holes in them so that they don't burst when they fill with steam. Cook them on a hot pan. I like to use a little bit of avocado oil, heat up the pan, and then I'll just throw the shishito peppers whole into the pan. I'll toss them a few times so that their skins blister on multiple sides. And then I just take them off the pan, put a little bit of flaky sea salt or something like that, some sort of kosher salt, on top of the peppers. And then I like to make a garlic aioli dipping sauce, which is really good with them. So, as I said, that's a very common way to cook them. That's not anything that I invented. They're very delicious that way. So, the one downside to that, personally, is a textural thing for me, which is that I don't really like to eat pepper seeds. A lot of people just eat the peppers whole and don't really care. So I kind of like nibble around the edges and just leave the seed cluster at the end. So it makes it a little bit challenging to eat. The rest of my family doesn't care. They'll just, well, my son doesn't eat peppers. He doesn't like them. But everyone else in my family will just eat the peppers whole and not really care about the seeds. But if you care about the seeds, just know that that is something that you're going to have to work around. For me, they're delicious enough that I'm fine with doing that, and I just enjoy them anyway. So I am interested in other ways to cook shishitos. As I said, that's mostly how we cook them. We just have them as a side dish with dinner. If you have other ways that you love to cook shishitos, I would love to hear recipes from you because I would love to get some ideas for next year. So feel free to go ahead and check the comments if you're looking for recipes because I would love to hear, you know, I mentioned for shishitos, but if you have recipes for any of these pepper varieties that I mentioned, I would love to hear from you about how you like to cook those and enjoy eating them as well. So the next pepper variety that I want to mention is a classic pepper variety, but nonetheless, it was one that I grew for the very first time this year. This was the red Marconi pepper. This is another one that I was trialing to see about being a possible bell pepper replacement. And I don't know, for some reason, whenever I had heard about this pepper, or I thought I had seen pictures of it, and I pictured it as being an elongated pepper, kind of similar to the Corno de Toro. But when I grew them, they actually ended up basically looking like bell peppers. I was really surprised. They might have been slightly elongated and slightly skinnier than a bell pepper, but they really just looked like bell peppers to me. I was very favorably impressed with the red Marconi. I really enjoyed them this year. As I said, they were just basically like bell peppers to me. They were very sweet. I had a decent yield from, I think I only had one plant of red Marconi this year, but I had a really good yield from it. I was surprised because, as I said, they were bell pepper shaped and sized peppers, but I got more peppers from the plant than I would have from a bell pepper. So I'm happy with those. I'll be growing that again next year. One thing I did hear from a lot of you when I was talking about the pepper varieties that I was planning to grow at the very beginning of this season, a lot of you recommended the giant Marconi pepper, which is a hybrid. I looked into it and I almost did purchase it to grow this year. I guess it is supposed to be a superior version to the red Marconi. I haven't actually tried that one myself. So if you are one of the people who recommended it, or if you've tried that, I would love to hear more details about your experience growing that pepper in the comments below. But anyway, what happened was when I was looking at the giant Marconi pepper, I found a similar variety called the mega Marconi pepper. Basically, the giant Marconi pepper is a hybrid. I'm not sure. There's a bunch of crows in the tree up there. I'm not really sure what they're doing, but they're being quite loud. Probably yelling at my chickens. So the idea with the giant Marconi hybrid is that it is supposed to be an improved version of the red Marconi that yields better. But because it's a hybrid, what that means is that, as I kind of alluded to earlier in this video, I wouldn't necessarily be able to save seeds from it. Now, you can save seeds from a hybrid. I could grow seeds from it and I would still get a pepper. But you're not guaranteed with a hybrid. The genetics are not stabilized, which means that you don't know exactly what you're going to get. So I could get something similar to the giant Marconi. I could get something similar to either of the parents or the giant Marconi, or some completely other different type of pepper. You don't really know. And because of that, there's nothing wrong with hybrids, but I tend to err more on the side of growing heirlooms and open pollinated varieties because I really like to save seeds. So when I was researching the giant Marconi variety, I discovered the mega Marconi, which is basically a stabilized version of the giant Marconi. So a breeder took the time to stabilize the genetics of the giant Marconi over many generations of plants. And this was supposed to be a great pepper. So I decided to try that one instead this year. Now, I did not have the greatest success with it. First of all, the seeds, I had trouble germinating them. So I think I got 2 seeds to germinate and one of the seedlings didn't survive. So I only ended up with one mega Marconi plant and it yielded, I think, 2 peppers for me. They were good peppers, but I wasn't really pleased with the yield. What I may try to do, I'll probably give that one another chance and grow it again next year and see how it compares. If I have a similar experience again next year, then I probably won't grow that one again. But I am considering trying out the giant Marconi next year that many of you recommended. So if you have experience with either the mega Marconi or the giant Marconi, I would love to hear either of those from you. The next pepper that I tried was the lipstick pepper. Now, I liked this one. It wasn't exactly what I was looking for because it tended to yield more smaller peppers, where I was looking, again, I was looking at this one as a potential bell pepper replacement. The peppers were good. They had good flavor. They were pretty. I enjoyed them. I felt like the yield was not exactly what I was going for. That being said, I liked it enough that I would probably try it again next year and see how it compares. I think if you are looking for something more like a snacking pepper, I think that this one might be a good choice. It was smaller, it was bigger, I should say, than, you know, you can get those really mini snacking peppers. They come in, I think, red, orange, and yellow. Those are really good. It was bigger than those, but smaller than what I was looking for. So I'm not sure. I'll see how many varieties I have that I want to grow next year. I may end up growing that one again. But if I have to bump some varieties from my list, that might be one of the ones that gets bumped. So I also want to mention the Varieties pepper. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So this is another one that I was trialing to see how it compared as a potential bell pepper replacement. I did not have the greatest success with this pepper this year. What I found was that for some reason the peppers didn't seem to be held on the plant as securely. You know, I had a pretty crowded container garden this year, and I found when I was walking through the container garden, if I bumped the plant, sometimes the green peppers would fall off the plant, and they were still completely usable. But what I really wanted was for them to fully ripen so I could experience the full ripe flavor. I still have a couple peppers on the plant. I don't know if they're going to have time to ripen before frost or not, but I didn't really get to experience the ripe flavor from those peppers, as I said, because they just seemed to fall from the plant easily. I'm not sure if that was just a fluke, if it was a random thing this year, but I did not have that experience with my other pepper varieties, so I'm not sure. I didn't really have enough information to go on, I guess, to decide how I feel about that pepper variety. The green peppers that were knocked from the plants, I did end up using them, and I was happy with them, but as I said, I prefer my peppers to be ripe. So if you have experience with the Varieties pepper, I'd love to hear how it went for you because I don't really have a lot of information to share about that one this year. The final pepper variety that I want to mention this year is the Varieties pepper. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that one right. I really enjoy this pepper. This is another one that I was kind of using instead of a bell pepper. I found that it's a beautiful pepper. It's delicious. Honestly, as far as flavor goes, this is probably my favorite of all the sweet peppers that I grew. The walls are really thick, thicker than a bell pepper. So this is a delicious pepper. If I'm going just by flavor, then this would be the one that I would recommend. I will say that the yield was fine. I would prefer a little more yield. The peppers tend to be a little on the smaller side. They're really pretty. They're like heart-shaped peppers with a little point, and they're fun. So I'm definitely going to continue growing those, but I wouldn't grow only those because I feel like I would prefer a little more yield. As I said, it wasn't a bad yield. I just prefer a little more. But overall, I'm happy with those. I do really enjoy them. And actually, one or two of you mentioned last year, when I mentioned the Varieties pepper in my lineup of plants I was growing this year, one or two of you mentioned that there is an orange variety as well. So we'll see how ambitious I am with hunting for seeds. I may end up giving that a try next year too. We'll see what happens. So, you know, that's my review of my peppers from the 2024 garden. I tried to give you guys as much detail as I can. Hopefully that's helpful to you. If you have experience with any of the varieties that I've mentioned, especially if your experience is different from mine, as always, I would love to hear how they did for you. If you have any other pepper varieties that you want to recommend, either hot peppers or sweet peppers, or bell peppers that yield more than most bell peppers do, I would definitely love to hear that too. So I hope that you guys had an amazing gardening year. I hope that you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.